Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event. Mazars, thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you. It's always a pleasure to be at a Mazars event. It's not always a pleasure to be at my accountant, by the way, but always at a Mazars event. And I'm delighted to be here, particularly with those of you from the retail trade in particular, which if I had another life, I think everybody, I would have some sort of linkage or involvement in the retail trade. It's an area that I find particularly interesting as a consumer more than anything else. So, or as a window shopper more recently, given the high state of inflation and the low state of my wage packet. So thank you again for coming through. I'm going to give you a macro overview of where, I see where South Africa is at. Take out your hip flasks, have a drink or two or three. The message isn't necessarily pretty, but obviously there are dynamics in each and every industry that often occur notwithstanding the big macro issues that are buffeting us on a daily basis. And of course, whilst you are all involved on a sort of a micro level in your particular endeavors and fields, you have a business to run. You have to wake up in the morning, you've got customers to serve, and those big macro issues that I do talk about obviously have to be managed in a way, but managed as effectively as you can within a very difficult operating environment indeed. So let me just begin by simply saying that those were the happy days. They were the happy days. It's just not that happy anymore. And I don't want to be too negative. I think we do have to be realistic ultimately as to where we're at in South Africa, and also very realistic in particular about some of the aspects relating to the retail space, and also particularly on issues of debt. And I know you'll discuss aspects of financing later on in this particular afternoon session. So the happy days there. But it doesn't really matter where you are in the world. And I suppose it's the point that I always make to any audience. It makes me feel better by saying it, because then I don't depress you too much about South Africa. It doesn't matter where you are. We're currently living in a very unusual global environment. And it doesn't matter which aspect of business you are in. This level of geopolitical risk, global risk, which has manifested itself over the course of the last year and a half in a multitude of crises, what of course fancy academics call polycrises, really affects absolutely everything that we do. I mean, your bottom line, your inflationary pressures that you are experiencing, your margins that you are trying to maintain are really all now being affected by many of these big macro issues that are happening across the world and can spread to other regions across the world in future as well. And of course, those big issues that have plagued us over the last couple of years, particularly inflation, that really is at the forefront, I think, of the consumer concerns going forward. It's at the forefront also of the kind of services and products that you want to attract, with which you want to attract customers. This issue of inflation has been a long time coming, I might add. It hasn't just been a feature of the world since the Russia invasion of Ukraine. We've seen very suspect economic policy coming out of the US Fed. Money has been cheap for too long. And the US Fed probably should have raised interest rates incrementally a lot earlier, but they simply didn't predict the veracity and longevity and stickiness of inflation, by their own admission, more or less. So for a world in which, we have thought that the US would be less important in all our lives 10 years ago, what the US Fed does or doesn't do has remained a critical aspect of where we are today within South Africa and globally as well. And the US Fed have been playing catch up ever since, raising interest rates at a lickety-split rate, which has had, of course, a negative effect on so many aspects of all of our lives. I mean, against this backdrop, there's that Top Gun photo shoot. There are new alliances being formed across the world, new friendships being made. Some of those friendships look as though they're going to take also a potentially threatening turn over the next number of years as the world looks as though it's fragmenting. It's fragmenting into different blocks, a little bit like the Cold War that some of us, as old as me, lived through during the 60s, 70s, and 80s before the Berlin Wall came down. And it does look as though we are seeing this fragmentation. More about that a little bit later. All sorts of relationships are being forged, I might add, and some of those relationships clearly will affect us here in South Africa as well. A little more about that later. So these stresses that we've seen in the world have again manifest themselves not just in supply chains, not just in sanctions, not just in global tension, but the banking system certainly. Many of the major banks in this world have had extreme pressure. Who would have thought, frankly, if I was standing here a year ago and I would have said to you, well, a bank like Credit Suisse was going to be in trouble, such trouble that it would have to be ultimately merged into UBS in Switzerland, you might have said, Daniel, what are you smoking? It's not going to get that bad. So you really have to expect in this very fragile world the potential for great disruption, and being ready for disruption ultimately is one of the core features that all of us must be ready, and we've got to play out those disruptive scenarios within our own businesses as well. Clearly, the issue of climate change remains at the forefront of all that we should be doing in terms of our businesses, and that adds another layer of complexity and, of course, another layer of cost to much of what we do. So when we go around the world and we look to see where is the world currently in terms of economic growth, how are different countries performing, again, you can kind of see on the chart, and the global economy has sort of settled into an uninspiring growth pattern. Certainly for the course of this year, it's better than it was, but ultimately it's looking a little bit testy. We're going to see economic growth globally down a little bit on 2022 when the world was still largely recovering out of COVID. Now, for the United States, the US economy is going to skirt with a potential recession. It may be a very weak recession if it occurs, but it is on a recessionary watch, I would argue. In the United Kingdom, well, also on a kind of recessionary watch, although it might just survive formal recessionary territory. The growth areas of this world are plain to see. Southeast Asia in particular. I was in Southeast Asia in December. I mean, when you go to Vietnam and you go to Malaysia and you see that level of growth in those economies coming out of COVID, consumer demand in particular, those economies looking pretty good. China on the recovery, although China's recovery is also going to be patchy as she goes forward, but still, we are likely to see that economy plus India, which I still regard as the biggest sort of star economy, just because of its sheer size and because India can grow this year still at anywhere between 5 and 6%. Wow, 5 and 6% growth for a country of 1.4 billion people? I always say that when you talk about growth in South Africa, what are we looking at? Flatline growth in South Africa. They're going to grow at 6%, 5.5% in India. It's fantasy stuff for us in South Africa. So the world is fragmenting. It's certainly got different tones of growth in many regions of the world. There is better news, and some might say that I never present better news. There is better news because we are starting to see the effects of a softening in key commodity prices, particularly in the price of food globally. That should factor into the rising inflation that we've seen across the world, hopefully eventually into ours as well. But certainly internationally, we've seen inflation look as though it's beginning to plateau to some degree and start now to taper off as a result of commodity food prices in particular falling back. We've seen oil prices as well falling back quite a bit. Oil prices have fallen back because of fears of a recession and also fears of an uneven economic recovery in China, despite the fact that they will grow at about 5% this year. So you're starting to see important dips in energy costs, important dips in food costs as well. And from a global inflation point of view, it does give us some element of hope that that particular threat could very well be managed, at least for the moment. But it's left politicians and presidents and prime ministers scratching their head across the world. Doesn't matter where you are. US inflation certainly is a little down, and that brings some encouragement to that particular economy. But US interest rates have risen so quickly that you are now starting to see that delayed effect on consumer spending in the United States itself. Consumer sentiment is certainly down. That's the bottom chart. Long-term inflation expectations remain relatively elevated in the United States, but from a retail perspective, we've started to see just a little bit of life in retail sales in that particular country, rising for the first time in 3 months. So there might be an element of optimism that this very extreme interest rate cycle that we've seen, these increases from the US Fed, look as though they're beginning perhaps to reach their climax. And as a result, you start to see a little bit of optimism creeping into the retail space as well. But in the interim, of course, post-COVID, post-inflation, post-Ukraine, US consumers have been tightening their belt like everybody else. They've been changing their shopping habits. They've been trading down. They've adjusted the amount of quantity of goods that they've bought. They've been delaying purchases. They've changed retailers for cheaper options going forward. They've moved towards private labels as opposed to branded goods. All of those trading down features that, frankly, we also see here to some degree, certainly for the rich Americans, they've been feeling it very much as well. And when you go to America, you see what's thriving, what's doing relatively well. Those discount grocers are doing well. The Aldis of this world doing remarkably well. And Walmart's results, which came out today, I might add, were generally very positive as well. So there is a shift to those discount retailers, certainly in the US. But it's a tough environment. Just in the course of the last week or so, you've seen Bed Bath & Beyond. It's my wife's favorite store. It was my wife's favorite store in the United States, file for bankruptcy. Gosh, that's been on the skids for a while. One thing about South Africa, our retail environment is pretty sophisticated. We don't see that visible decline that I have witnessed in Bed Bath & Beyond for years, going to the United States and spending my time going into shopping malls and going into big box stores. That store has been emptying out of stock for years. For those going to America, it's a bit like J.C. Penney and some of those other stores. They've been in decline. Sears, in decline for years. There's not much left of many of those other stores as well. And even those big names like Amazon, looking to cut costs, looking to do more with less. Even the giant Amazon having a rougher year than they've had before. Of course, on the upside, we've seen a direct contrast in luxury retailers doing remarkably well, particularly, of course, LVMH, with some of our own South African connections involved. There again, you're seeing high net worth individuals, a greater proportion of those high net individuals being created in the Chinas and Indias of this world. And that's propelling, in a sense, much of that luxury good market as well, as China certainly comes out of the COVID pandemic itself. So an interesting contrast, I suppose, but for the vast majority of consumers out there, it is ultimately trading down. Across in the United Kingdom, similar issues remain. UK consumer price inflation remains high. At least the graph has stopped going up in terms of that inflationary pressure. So there's a little bit of good news as there. But UK consumer confidence still languishing. Also, look, the graph is a little bit up there on the right. They tell me I mustn't be too negative. So let's take that little bit of upturn there on the right for the UK consumer, looking a bit good. But, it's not a pretty picture in the UK. Yeah, it's not a pretty picture here. But it's also not a pretty picture in the UK. UK food insecurity is on the rise. This is the United Kingdom. We're not talking about a developing world country, although some in the United Kingdom will say that they are now a developing country, I might add. But the United Kingdom, nearly 10 million Brits, that's 1 out of 7, more or less, are experiencing food insecurity this year. 1 out of 7, food insecurity. To me, that's a shocker. And I visit the UK quite regularly. I'll be there in a couple of months' time. I'm going to look and I'm going to see what I can find. But even in the UK, some of those household names in retail have been under severe pressure. John Lewis, those of you going to London and going elsewhere in the UK, you know the John Lewis store. You know the great story about John Lewis. It's a particular type of staff shareholding in the business, how that store has done so well. Even John Lewis today feeling the effects of these challenges in the retail space, along with, of course, their grocery partners in Waitrose as well. And the question now is asked in newspaper headlines, can they survive? That going is tough absolutely everywhere. Customers are spending more, fairly obviously, because they are paying more for goods as a result of inflation, but in quantity, in volume terms, and these are the global figures from Nielsen, in global figures, and this is global when I say international figures, the volumes themselves are not the same. So spend more, but ultimately they are purchasing a little bit less. Private label sales, of course, are taking up some of the slack with value-driven customers. And of course, if you go across the world, you'll see the private label share of sales over time. Just look at that, 43% of sales in Spain are private label, the UK 43%. So very advanced in terms of those particular markets. And in terms of growth, all of those countries are showing very distinct private label growth as well as we are here in South Africa. The big trend towards online seems to be continuing, but I think that online trend is also going to move, if the research houses are to be believed, into more of the developing world regions rather than just the Western Europe, Asia, and the United States. And certainly the projections for Middle East and Africa, which is the I'll show you on this one because I'm closer here, which is this murky sky blue line there, shows that certainly over the next few years or so, online looks as though, e-commerce looks as though the growth opportunities are going to be quite substantial, certainly not only for South Africa, but for the broader Africa region as well. So the global trends, many of them are very similar to what we see in South Africa, but it's a rough, tough environment elsewhere. Of course, it's a rough, tough, plus environment here for all of you. Now, you don't need me to remind you about the perilous state of the economy as it stands at the moment. We are now seeing growth in South Africa flatline. This is an economy that is barely growing. And, well, what can you say about it? They tell me I must talk it up. No, you can't talk it up. You cannot talk up the fact that we are going to grow barely this year at about zero. If we're lucky, we will grow for the whole year at about 0.5%. If we're lucky. I'm giving you the most optimistic projection. I would say we're going to flatline. And frankly, if you have a look at Eskom's projections for load shedding over the winter months, which they came out with this morning, you will have seen that Eskom are now predicting that we will have a minimum of stage 5 load shedding over the winter months. I'm not quite sure what constitutes winter, but perhaps over the next 3 months or so. A minimum of stage 5, with the highly likely scenario of moving towards stage 8, or frankly, in my opinion, perhaps even beyond. But Eskom have said anywhere between stage 5 and stage 8 guaranteed over our winter. And if that's the case, we lose in South Africa a quarter of potential economic activity. 1/4 of our year is going to be severely affected. And that's why I think that a growth rate of just over 0% or so is going to be threatened, and we might well find ourselves in a recession in the second and third quarter of this year. It's going to be very difficult for us to keep out of recessionary territory. From a consumer point of view, from a wealth creation point of view, our GDP has been so sluggish, it's been just downright disappointing. Our GDP has been so poor. When we measure GDP, we look at the GDP per capita that's divided by the population of South Africa. Now, you look at this green line, which is South Africa. The green line is South Africa. Our GDP per capita is now starting to cross downwards, so it is performing worse. It's performing worse than the broader average for emerging markets. Now, you will see that our GDP per capita has kept its head above water there. The better years of economic activity in South Africa were the 2010 high water mark for us, by the way, the World Cup period or so. And then, of course, the decline, emerging markets performing relatively well, and our GDP per capita now starting to look particularly poor when compared to other emerging markets across the world. I suppose there's no surprise. When you have unemployment as sticky as ever in South Africa, the latest figures showed that we had 32% of South Africans unemployed, and you need to add on another 4 million onto that of the discouraged work seekers to give us the overall expanded definition of unemployment. When you have that lack of economic involvement from such a large proportion of your population, your GDP per capita clearly is going to suffer. So in the retail trade, of course, we've seen power cuts. There are many issues at play here. There are policy issues, there's labor issues, but for the moment I'll talk about power cuts, load shedding disruptions to operations and supply chains in particular have affected margins and they've affected price points, particularly in your industry. And I think we're going to see that continue clearly. For the moment, I'll come back to that shortly. Of course, the cost of load shedding to business has been on the up for the last year and a half. And you don't need me to remind you of the diesel costs in particular. Here's the graphs, as you can see in rand terms, of what some of our major stores and other businesses have been now disclosing in terms of what the diesel cost depression for South African business really accumulates to. I think it's pretty frightening stuff. And I think what's important, of course, is that this is going to be priced in some form or other into the goods and services that we use and purchase on a daily basis. More on that in a moment. Let me just reiterate the recent report from TFG on the issue of load shedding and the effects of load shedding. And I'm just going to read these two paragraphs off the screen because I tell it much better than I can say it. TFG Africa lost conservatively 360,000 trading hours during the 12 months ended 31st of March. However, the true impact has been estimated at more than double this figure at around 730,000 trading hours lost. That's what TFG say. Now, here's the important part as well. Capital expenditure of 200 million rand has been spent on alternative power solutions to date, which under normal circumstances would have been invested more constructively in further expanding our store base, as well as other strategic capital projects. So the opportunity cost of spending on diesel and on all of the other related input costs to stave off load shedding certainly is having an effect on the industry in a broad sense of spending its coffers on the broader rollout of stores, services within the country. You've got to make a choice ultimately, and according to this, TFG certainly have made some sort of choice in terms of how to spend this kind of cash. Now, the position isn't made better by the indecision, by the strange neutrality position that South Africa has when it comes to her relations with Russia. These headlines on the allegations made by the US ambassador that South Africa is providing in some form or other arms to Russia made headlines all over the world. For my sins, I sit and I look at international press on a 24/7 basis, and I promise you, it is 24/7. My wife can't stand it anymore at 2, 3 a.m. in the morning when I'm looking at to see what are the outside world saying about South Africa. And there you go, that's what they're saying about South Africa, whether it's on CNN, which is the one on the left, whether it's in the Financial Times, doesn't matter where it is. This publicity was a shocker for South Africa. Now, I don't really want to get into the nuts and bolts of whether I believe we did supply any kind of armaments to Russia. All I will say is that I think there is such disarray in our particular state. The one hand doesn't know what the other one does. And it's entirely possible that something was loaded onto that particular ship in Simonstown, perhaps unbeknown to many parts of the state. And I think there are all sorts of rogue elements operating in all sorts of ways in our broader state. You've seen that in Eskom. You've seen the Zondo Commission report talk on this in terms of state-owned enterprises. There's every possibility that rogue elements could very well be involved in some sort of transferal of some sort of armaments into Russia. So, it may not be officially sanctioned, but, the story is still going to come out on this issue. Well, what happened? What happened was that we saw South Africa we saw the rand immediately react to this issue. Now, the rand over the course of the last number of years has been a heavily traded currency. You can make a lot of money on the rand, or you can lose a lot of money on the rand, either way, very, very quickly. But we've always seen the rand largely react to international issues. The value of the US dollar, for example, interest rates, very much sort of reactive. What we saw in the course of the last week was the rand become reactive to domestic issues within South Africa, to policy issues, to potentially having our trade relations with the United States damaged quite severely. And even, with all of the bluster that we've seen from the government in the last few days on this issue, the rand has not recovered back to its pre-US ambassador allegation days, and the rand now sits at very weak levels. What's it now? It's now at 19. If you want to look at your your rates, you'll see it's 1930 or 1940 or whatever it is, which is almost at the lows it was after these allegations were made. The rand is now reacting particularly adversely when compared to other currencies from emerging market countries. Our rand has performed particularly poorly. And that tells me that it's domestic concerns about South Africa that are now starting to drive our currency. Yes, other currencies have fared badly on other issues, but not as bad as our rand over the course of the last week or two. So markets are looking at domestic performance now. It's not just the US dollar and other more broader macroeconomic influences. South Africa's inflation rate remains elevated, as you know, 7.1%. It's sticky, much like inflation in other parts of the world. It's not 10% like in the UK, it's 7.1%. But here's the important point. Our food inflation rate in South Africa is running at double that of our inflation rate at about 14% or so. I think this is a very complex issue. You will know a lot more about this than me for that. But I'm going to, you look at it from an outsider point of view. Food double our normal inflation rate in South Africa. Take a look at what Stats South Africa identifies as the core items of consumer goods, foodstuffs in particular, that have gone up over the course of the last year. Onions, 45% increase in onions. That's March 23 compared to March 22. Maize meal, 35%. Samp, 32%. Carrots, 30%. These are very, very substantial price increases, but they are basic foodstuffs for the majority of South Africans. So what's really frightening, maize meal, samp, paraffin, potatoes, look at those price increases. Now that doesn't bode well for South Africa over the course of the next while, and you've seen warnings coming through from Agri SA, from of course Pick n Pay, relating to these price increases and relating to the effect certainly that power blackouts have on the manufacturing production and obviously dissemination of many of these goods into the retail environment. So retailers are faced with, maybe I'm pleased that I haven't got another life and I'm not going into the retail space, because retailers are now faced with that issue. In the last year and a half, they were faced with issues of civil unrest, particularly in KZN, and looting, which contributed to rising security costs, and of course the necessity of many retailers to look at their supply chains and the physical location of their distribution centers, certainly looking at where are the safer corridors to place these in future. There's a cost to that, and that cost also ultimately comes out of the bottom line, but it might also come out of the consumers' pockets. And that brings me to a very controversial point, and this point is made repeatedly by the Competition Commission in South Africa that monitors the prices of essential foods. Now, I'm sure many of you have looked at this report, but food prices have gone up particularly, and here's an example of cooking oil. Now, cooking oil has really gone up, the price of bread as well. The Competition Commission are now investigating further whether these increases are justified in terms of the global prices that have started to come down, as I've indicated at the beginning of this talk. And of course, there are questions being asked about the margins that retailers, even wholesalers or distributors, are able to achieve on many of these goods. When you're in a very high inflationary environment, everybody, the issue of margins becomes a political issue. And as we move into an election cycle next year, the price of basic foodstuffs is going to become, to use a very corny term, a hot potato, or I should say a hot, more expensive potato, as we move into that election cycle. So watch out for added scrutiny on this particular issue of the price of food. An external item, of course, is climate change, the El Nino effect that looks as though it's going to bring a degree of warmer weather into this part of the world. Not good news for us, because we know our climate is susceptible to drought and obviously the increasing costs born out of food price increases there as well. Climate change already is playing havoc to some degree with distributors and manufacturers, particularly in KZN and those parts of the country that have seen extreme flooding. There is a cost to this, of course, and there's a cost also to the potential of reconsidering locations for retail outlets and the broader logistic supply chain and infrastructure debate that South Africa still has at the moment. So look, here are the figures. Don't shoot the messenger. The retail sales figures came out yesterday, and as you can see on the chart, our retail sales have been dropping or down year on year for the past 4 months. There's the very last April figure that just came out yesterday. 4 months of retail sales drops. No surprise, given the broader macroeconomic conditions that we have. This is too washed out for you to see, and you can get this off the Stats SA website. But ultimately, you can just see which of the categories are performing better, perhaps, than others. Textile and clothing have been looking a little bit good. Food and beverages have been looking a little bit soft over the course of the last month or so. It's, of course, had its effect on our retail environment. For those of you that hold stock in any of our major retailers, I hope you bought that stock, or I hope you acquired that stock during, I'm not going to say during better days, but perhaps not too long ago, because we are now looking at very low valuations for certainly quite a few of our major retailers going forward, possibly a good buying opportunity if you are a risk taker and you want to put some of your hard-earned cash into the markets. But I think what's important is that the domestic spend in South Africa is certainly under threat. And what we've also seen in this very good report that came out from BankServe Africa only in the last couple of days or so, that inflation is not keeping up with salaries in South Africa, certainly this year. We've seen inflation, and you can see on the chart there, you've got the figures for 2018, 2019, 2021. You can see that salaries kept a pace to some degree with inflation. But look at the figure now for 2022. High inflation figures in 2022 and very low salary increases on average for salaried or working South Africans. And that really brings one to not a particularly startling conclusion that your middle class in South Africa, your salaried worker, is really under the cosh. They're really feeling it as a result of their salaries not keeping a pace with inflation. And similarly so, it's very difficult for South Africans to save. We also look at comparative savings rates across the world, and you can just see that in terms of their overall savings, Brazilians save quite a bit. Nearly 17% of their income is saved. South Africa, less than 1%, 0.5% or so. Again, obviously also a sign of the times, a sign of low salaries, high inflation, high utility bills that crowd out spending in other forms or other, and of course, great implications for retirement issues in future, healthcare services as well. Capitec came out with a really interesting little chart only a little while ago, just showing you the impact of interest rate hikes on the cost of debt and how those interest rate hikes reduce disposable income. And again, you can see South Africans are going to be spending more for obvious reasons on home loans, vehicle financing, personal loans, all of that hurting their disposable income going forward. That's why private consumption expenditure looks somewhat uninspiring, why consumer confidence levels looks fairly uninspiring. That's the reality of the environment. It's about 12 million South Africans, 12 million, withdraw all the money they receive once it's deposited virtually immediately, about 12 million. And for South Africans, according to the FinScore consumer survey, 33% will tell you that they are living in some sort of severe distress in not being able to cover their current living expenses. 33%, 26% saying that there is some distress in how they live. So, talk about a cash-strapped environment. We see an increase in South Africans who are now borrowing money just to put food on the table. And again, it's quite a substantial figure, and I would argue quite a worrying figure as well. Credit applications have increased. The application for credit has increased in South Africa. Approval consents for credit have remained pretty flatlined. So there's a demand for credit, but the formal approval rate is indeed pretty low as well. So there's a gap between the two, and South Africans are looking to fill the gap. I know you'll talk about this perhaps a little bit later, but certainly the buy now, pay later market, which is growing at a rapid rate in particular, filling in a sense that gap for credit and credit demand. From a political story and from a social story, I get concerned because Where are South Africans getting their money from? Well, 40% of South Africans get their income from government grants. 40% from government grants. We really are becoming what I refer to as a dependency nation. A dependency nation, dependent upon the state. You got to get out of this, but the only way to get out of it is to grow your economy with efficient and prudent best practice economic policies. So we move in a very difficult environment to 2024, the election next year. Aren't you looking forward to another bout of politicking from political parties, telephone calls? They're going to be nagging you, and there's so many political parties. Believe me, you will take so many junk calls and robocalls during the day. You better go on holiday over that particular period. It's a remarkable watershed election for South Africa, because this is going to be the first election where the ANC is not guaranteed of getting a full majority. That ANC support level has been on the slide now for the last 20 years or so. They only got 45.6% of the vote in the last local government elections. So if that was carried through to elections next year, the ANC would require a coalition partner or partners in order to govern. I think the ANC is going to do a little bit better, strangely enough, than 45.6% next year, and they could therefore find a smaller political party or two or three to put them over the 50% threshold. They might not need the EFF. They might be closer to 50% and therefore will not need a more disruptive coalition partner that the EFF is. And they certainly will try and avoid going into do any sort of deal with the Democratic Alliance or the other more moderate right-wing centre-right parties. So I think we're going to get a messy election result there next year. The ANC is still going to be in the power seats after July, August, or whenever the election will be. But I think the ANC is going to be a weak government with a very weak support base, which will create more tension and instability in the ANC as we move over the course of the next 5 years or so. South Africans are not happy. I'm not happy. South Africans are not happy. 74% of South Africans, when asked, do they believe the country is moving in the wrong direction? 74% say yes, they believe the country is moving in the wrong direction. So that's not a good poll for an incumbent political party to see 12 months out of an election. So expect some food parcels to be handed out. Expect some housing units suddenly to become available. Expect even load shedding, perhaps into next year, to be alleviated by some miracle of technology. Expect that as the ANC moves towards trying to shore up its vote. You know what happens at local government level. We've seen all sorts of coalitions. Some are collisions rather than coalitions. Some actually work, as we had in Cape Town for quite a while. If coalitions are the will of the people, which they may well be in the election next year, we will have to work through our maturation process. Our political system has to mature. We have to move away from single party domination. If it means messy coalitions, well, we'll work with it and we'll live with it. From a retail perspective, I think it's also a cost to doing business. The inefficiencies that we see at a local government level in particular, municipalities certainly have had great difficulty in maintaining standards. Consumers are also shifting their physical location in South Africa, a high degree of semigration out of Gauteng and possibly even KZN of middle-class South Africans looking perhaps to find refuge here in the Western Cape. And that also, I think, is going to shift some retail imperatives as middle-class demands become perhaps a bit more enhanced in this part of the world, perhaps compared to other areas where there has been semigration from. What a lot of issues. And there are more. Some final thoughts on where we're at. Whether you're in retail, and you are mostly in the retail trade sort of arena, in the financing arena as well, look, in the end, your business continues, and as I've said before, notwithstanding those big picture issues, you've got to get the basics right. So you've got to connect with your customers, of course. You've got to understand their behavior, understand their aspirations, and you're going to do this through digital and product innovation. Notwithstanding what happens elsewhere, you've got to do that. You've got to remain competitive, and you can grow your business, notwithstanding those constraints that I've mentioned. All of us are becoming much more data-centric, and that will drive decision-making, particularly in the retail space. ESG priorities remain critically important. In South Africa, I think there are varying affinities or interests in ESG along many of our different internal groupings within South Africa, LSM categories. But I still think that ESG is critical to enable affordable and sustainable products being put on our shelves within South Africa. It's critical. Globally, we see it, and there's an increasing appetite for that in South Africa as well. I've mentioned before, house brands are going to be even more important. Loyalty schemes, I think, are mutating, but continue to be important, locked in or mixed in with financial services as well. And of course, all of these issues together with data management are set to influence where the shopper goes, where the footfall is going to be. There are some positives. We shouldn't be all negative. All of these rising costs, all of these influences should promote more local sourcing, along with more innovative partnerships domestically within South Africa, particularly with startups. Yeah, some of the big retailers have tried this. Some of them do it. Pick n Pay have been relatively successful in trying this, and kudos to them for doing that. I like this partnership with startups, and we should be looking for that within our own domestic context, and in particular because the global environment is changing. China's supply chain disruptions, trade tariffs, potential sanctions, tension over Taiwan in future really should provide a new impetus for aspects of localization, or at least sourcing products locally. It's good. It's good for business. It's good for social responsibility. It's good ultimately for the country as well. And despite all of the challenges that I mentioned, you've got 60 million consumers. It's competitive as ever, and brands are seeking prominence and market share. Online growth is on the up. The opportunities are there. The discounters are on the up. The opportunities are there in particular. And some sectors, like the cosmetics sector, set to grow and grow very well over the course of the next few years or so. There's going to be competition in the marketplace from these guys as they come into the e-commerce market over the course of the next year or so. But of course, real opportunity exists in the informal sector, which now represents anywhere between 18 and 25% of South African GDP. 1 in every 5 rand and 1/3 of all consumer packaged goods sold in the country is done via the informal sector, and integrating therein, which has often been an issue, continues to be, I think, a key focus of attention. Focus of attention, these are the guys of the future, everybody. Those are the guys in the future. They want goods and services. They also want excitement in retail. They want something fresh in retail. Some stores are doing that, and to their credit, they've been able to introduce new products into what is a very tough retail environment. I'm telling you, I had some Prime. I went and I lined up, I bought some Prime. I say it was for my daughter, but actually I wanted to try it. The strange thing is I had the lemon and lime variety, and the strange thing is my eyesight improved during the course of the week that I enjoyed a little tot of the lemon and lime. Strange. Now that I've run out of it, and as Checkers have run out of it, my eyesight is back to its blurry self. So look, don't poo-poo Prime, but what I love about it is that it's just brought some fun, some excitement back into the retail market. And for goodness sake, we need a little bit of fun in our lives. Thanks very much.